The candles at Ashworth Hall burned brighter than they had in months. Aunt Margaret had seen to that herself, walking the dining room twice before the guests arrived, straightening silver that didn't need straightening, fussing over a tablecloth that was already perfect. A duke was coming to dinner. Not just any duke, the Duke of Ravensworth, a man whose name alone could open doors that had been closed to the Ashworth family for years. Margaret intended to make the most of it. Her daughters, Charlotte and Louisa, had been dressed since 4 o'clock. Her son, Edmund, had been coached on which topics to raise and which to avoid. Everything in the house had been arranged, polished, and positioned. Everything except the one thing Margaret had spent 3 years trying to make disappear. Upstairs, in a room at the end of the coldest corridor in the house, Emma Ashworth sat with a shawl wrapped twice around her shoulders and watched her breath turn, faintly visible in the air. She was 20 years old. In 1 month she would be 21. She did not know why that mattered. No one had ever told her it should. She heard the carriage before she saw it, wheels on gravel, the stamp of horses, voices rising from the courtyard below. She moved to the window out of habit more than curiosity and watched a tall man in a dark greatcoat step down from the carriage and glance, briefly, up at the house. For half a second, she thought he looked directly at her window. Then a footman said something, and the man's attention moved away, and the moment passed. Emma let the curtain fall back into place. Whoever he was not coming for her. No one ever did. Downstairs, the Duke of Ravensworth was greeted with the kind of warmth that announced itself a little too loudly. Margaret curtsied lower than necessary. Charlotte laughed at something that wasn't especially amusing. Edmund shook his hand twice. The Duke accepted it all with the polite, unreadable patience of a man who had attended 100 dinners exactly like this one. He had not come for the company. He had come because his late father and the elder Mr. Ashworth had been friends once, and there were matters of an old agreement, a small parcel of land, a debt long forgotten by everyone but his solicitor, that needed settling before he could, in good conscience, close the file. It was meant to be one evening, nothing more. The first sign that something in the house did not add up came an hour into dinner, when a young maid entered to refill the wine and was asked, off-handedly, by Louisa, whether she had remembered to bring up a tray. "For Miss Emma, miss," the maid asked before catching herself. The table went very quiet for exactly 1 second. "That will be all," Margaret said, in a voice that did not rise but somehow filled the room anyway. The maid curtsied and left. The conversation resumed, Edmund asking the Duke a question about hunting, Charlotte laughing again, but the Duke had not picked his fork back up. "Miss Emma," he repeated mildly, as though merely turning the name over. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure." "My late brother's daughter," Margaret said smoothly. "She keeps to herself. Delicate health, I'm afraid. We don't trouble her with company." It was, the Duke thought, a very practiced sentence. The kind of sentence a person says often enough that it stops sounding rehearsed even to themselves. He said nothing further on the matter. He was, after all, a guest, and a man did not press his hosts about family matters that were none of his concern. But he was also a man who had spent the better part of his own childhood being talked around in rooms exactly like this one, discussed in the third person, managed, minimized, and he recognized the shape of it even now, even second-hand, even in a house that was not his own. He glanced once toward the staircase visible through the open dining room door, and said nothing more about it that night. Upstairs, Emma ate the cold remains of a dinner brought up an hour late, alone, as she had eaten nearly every dinner for 3 years. She did not know that a stranger downstairs had just asked her name. She would have been astonished to learn that he intended to ask it again. It was past midnight when Emma heard it, the small, distinct click of a key turning in her door from the outside. She sat up in bed, the cold air biting through her shawl. The sound was not new. The lock itself had been there for years, fitted not long after her father's funeral, when Aunt Margaret had explained in that same smooth voice that it was for Emma's own safety, though safety from what, no one had ever said. What was new was that it had never once been asterisk used before tonight. For 3 years the door had remained unlocked, mostly because there had been no need. Emma had nowhere to go, no one to go to, and Margaret had never seemed to think her capable or brave enough of leaving. The lock had simply hung there, a quiet threat that didn't need to be carried out. Tonight someone had carried it out. Emma rose and crossed the room, pressing her palm flat against the door as if she might feel some explanation through the wood. She tried the handle anyway. It did not move. Below her window, she could hear the last of the carriages departing, the Duke's, she assumed, though she didn't know what time visitors usually left a house like this. She had so little practice with the rhythms of normal life. She knew her own room, the back stairs the servants used when they remembered to bring her meals, and the small garden she was occasionally permitted to walk in when Margaret was not entertaining. She did not know why tonight, of all nights, warranted a locked door. She sat back down on the edge of her bed and tried to think it through logically, the way her father had once taught her to do with figures and accounts, back when he still came home each evening and asked about her day as though her answer mattered. Think it through, Emma. What is different about tonight? A duke had come to dinner. That was different. But dukes, presumably, came and went from grand houses all the time, and surely her aunt did not lock her in every time a titled guest arrived. Unless this guest was different. Unless this guest had asked her name. She had no way of knowing that he had, the maid hadn't told her, and even if she had, Emma would not have understood why a single polite question at a dinner table could possibly matter enough to warrant a turned key. But some old instinct, sharpened by 3 years of watching her aunt's face for the small signs that preceded bad news, told her that something about this evening had unsettled the careful order of the house. She thought, too, about the date. Tomorrow would mark 1 month until her 21st birthday. She had noticed Margaret circling it on the household calendar weeks ago, in faint pencil, as though trying not to be seen marking it at all. She did not know what turning 21 was meant to change. No one had ever explained to her what, if anything, she was owed not by this family, and not by the father who had died and left her here. She only knew that the date sat in her aunt's mind like a stone, weighed and watched, the way a debt is watched as it comes due. She lay back against the thin pillow, listening to the house settle into silence below her, and allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, a small and dangerous thought. Something is being kept from me, and someone tonight may have noticed. It was not hope, not yet. Emma had learned, slowly and at some cost, not to let herself hope, but it was something close to it, a single, unfamiliar thread of curiosity, pulling tight in her chest as she finally closed her eyes. Downstairs, in the guest wing of Ashworth Hall, the Duke of Ravensworth was not yet asleep either. He stood at his window for a long while, looking out at a house that, by every outward measure, seemed perfectly ordinary, and could not shake the feeling that somewhere above him, behind one of its dark windows, something was being very carefully hidden. He told himself it was not his concern. He had come to settle a matter of land and debt, nothing more, and he would be gone within the day or two it took to conclude the business properly. But he found, as he finally lay down to sleep, that the image of an empty chair at the dinner table, a place that should have been set and was not, stayed with him rather longer than it should have. The Duke woke early, as he always did, and found himself unwilling to leave Ashworth Hall as quickly as he had originally planned. He told his host, over a hurried breakfast, that a detail in the old land agreement required closer review, a half-truth, though not entirely a lie. There was a clause worth checking. It simply did not require him to stay another full day to check it. Margaret accepted the news with visible pleasure, already calculating the further advantage of a duke lingering under her roof, and arranged for him to be shown to the late Mr. Ashworth's old study, where the family papers were kept. It was on his way there, taking what he later realized was the wrong staircase entirely, that the Duke heard it faint, almost nothing. A cough, quickly muffled, behind a closed door at the end of an unheated corridor. He paused. The corridor was different from the rest of the house. No carpet, no portraits. The wallpaper faded in a way that suggested no fire had warmed these walls in a long time. He took a few steps toward the sound before a voice stopped him. "You've lost your way, Your Grace." Margaret had appeared with the kind of speed that suggested she'd been watching for exactly this. Her smile was warm. Her eyes were not. "I believe I have," the Duke said evenly. "I heard someone unwell." "A relation," Margaret said, already turning him gently by the elbow back toward the main hall, her voice dropping into something confidential and sad. "My late brother's daughter, as I mentioned. Her health, and I'm sorry to say, her mind as well, it isn't what it should be. We keep her comfortable, quiet. It's kinder in cases like hers not to disturb her with company." It was, the Duke thought, a very efficient lie, sympathetic enough to discourage further questions, vague enough to cover any detail he might later catch her in. He had heard lies like it before, not about a girl, but about himself once long ago, when he was 11 years old and a steward his father had trusted a little too well had told the household, in just such a gentle and regretful tone, that the young heir was unwell, and best not troubled, with the running of an estate that steward had been quietly emptying for 2 years. It had taken his uncle nearly a year to uncover what was happening. The Duke had never forgotten the particular flavor of that helplessness, being spoken about, managed, handled asterisk, while everyone around him nodded along because the lie was so much easier than the question. He said none of this to Margaret. He only said, "Of course, forgive my curiosity," and let himself be led away. But he did not forget the sound of that cough, and he did not believe, even for a moment, that he had heard the voice of a madwoman. He spent the rest of the morning in the study as planned, reviewing the land agreement with the kind of careful attention that gave him an excuse to ask the elderly clerk who kept the estate's correspondence a few quiet questions of his own, about the family, about the household, about the late Mr. Ashworth. The clerk, a man named Hodges who had served the family for over 30 years and had grown noticeably tired of being ignored, answered more freely than Margaret would have liked. "Lovely man, the old master," Hodges said, polishing his spectacles. "Doted on his daughter something terrible, in the good way, I mean. Taught her his accounts himself, if you can believe it. Said she'd a head for figures sharper than her cousin Edmund's. God rest him for saying it where Mrs. Ashworth couldn't hear. And after he died." Hodges's expression shifted just slightly. Sudden that was, very sudden, strong as an ox 1 month gone the next. He cleared his throat as though he'd said more than he meant to. "The young miss took it very hard. Hasn't been seen much in company since." 3 years, I understand." "Thereabouts, Your Grace." The Duke nodded slowly, filing the detail away with the others, the cough behind the locked door, the empty chair at dinner. The dates circled faintly on a household calendar he had not been meant to notice but had, the previous evening, glimpsed open on a hall table. He did not yet have a clear picture, but the pieces he did have were beginning to suggest a shape he did not like. He decided, before the day was through, that he would not be leaving Ashworth Hall as quickly as he had told Margaret he would. What the Duke did not yet know, what no one outside Ashworth Hall's narrowest circle of trust was meant to know, was contained in a document locked inside Margaret Ashworth's writing desk, beneath a false bottom she had installed herself, with her own hands, 3 years ago. It was her late brother's will. Richard Ashworth had not been a wealthy man by the standards of dukes and earls, but he had been a careful one and a fair one, and when he sat down with his solicitor 2 years before his death, he had written a will that reflected both of those qualities. The bulk of his property, Ashworth Hall itself, along with the income from its lands, would pass, as expected, to his nephew Edmund, the family's male heir. But there was a second provision, a smaller one, easy to overlook unless you were the kind of man who read every line twice. To his daughter, Emma, upon her 21st birthday, he left a separate property, a modest but unencumbered house some 20 miles distant, inherited through her late mother's family, along with a sum of £4,000, held in trust until that date. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. Enough for a young woman to live independently, respectably, without ever again needing to depend on the goodwill of relations who did not particularly want her. It was, in its quiet way, exactly what a father who loved his daughter and distrusted his sister-in-law's warmth might have arranged. Richard had told Margaret about the provision himself, not long before he died, in a tone she had found insultingly cautious, as though he suspected, even then, what she might do if Emma were ever left in her care without that protection written down. He had been right to suspect it. Margaret had spent the first year of her brother's absence simply waiting, watching the date on the calendar approach the way one watches a debt come due, turning the problem over in her mind from every angle. She had 3 children of her own to provide for, and a household income that, however comfortable, did not stretch as generously as appearances suggested. £4,000 and a house were not enormous sums, but they were not nothing, either, and they were sums that, by rights, ought to have come to her own family, not to a niece who contributed nothing and asked for less. It was her solicitor, not the honest Hodges, who managed the estate's daily correspondence, but a second man, a Mr. Prout, brought in privately and paid privately, who had explained over the course of several careful conversations exactly how such an inheritance might be redirected. The will, Prout explained, contained a clause, standard in such documents, allowing an heir's portion to be withheld or reassigned if that heir could be shown, before a magistrate or the family's own legal representative, to be incapable of managing her own affairs, whether through infirmity of mind or simple absence from the proceedings meant to confirm her claim. It would require, Prout said, very little, a pattern of seclusion well established over several years, so that no one in society could credibly claim surprise at the girl's condition, a household willing to testify, if asked, that her health and her temperament had grown steadily more troubled since her father's death. And on the day itself, her 21st birthday, her simple absence from the room where the inheritance was to be formally claimed, which could then be quietly recorded as confirmation of incapacity, the property and the sum reassigned, in the absence of any objection, to the family currently in possession of the estate. In short, if Emma was never seen, never heard, never permitted to stand before anyone and speak for herself, if the world had 3 years to grow accustomed to thinking of her as the strange, delicate niece who kept to her room, then on the day her inheritance came due, there would be no one in the room to claim it, and no one outside the room inclined to ask why. Margaret had found the plan distasteful at first. She told herself in the early months that she was simply protecting Emma, that a girl so withdrawn, so altered by grief, truly was better off shielded from society's harsher judgments. She had nearly convinced herself of it. But 3 years of locked doors and cold meals carried up late had worn that comfortable fiction thin, even for her. She no longer entirely believed her own kindness. She simply found it easier now to not examine the matter too closely. Tomorrow, though Margaret had not told Emma this, had in fact taken pains to ensure Emma did not know the precise date at all, was the day appointed for the reading. Prout would arrive in the morning with the necessary papers. A brief, quiet meeting would be held in the study. Emma would not be present because Emma did not know it was happening, and because, as of last night, Emma's door was locked from the outside for the first time in 3 years. A precaution Margaret had not needed before, but felt, after watching a duke ask a stranger's name with far too much interest at her dinner table, suddenly necessary. It was meant to be the final, quietest step in a plan 3 years in the making. Margaret did not know yet that the Duke of Ravensworth had heard a cough behind a locked door that very morning, and had not believed a word of her explanation for it. She did not know that a clerk named Hodges, tired of being overlooked for 30 years, had just spent the better part of an hour answering a duke's careful questions, rather more honestly than she would have liked. And she certainly did not know that, somewhere above her in a cold and unheated room, a young woman who had spent 3 years believing herself forgotten by the entire world was, for the first time, beginning to wonder exactly what it was that everyone around her seemed so determined she never discover. The household clock in the front hall struck 4. Prout was expected by 9 the following morning. There were not many hours left. The Duke did not sleep well that second night either, though he told himself it was simply the unfamiliar bed, the unfamiliar house, the faint draught that crept beneath the guest room door no matter how he arranged the curtains against it. He lay awake instead turning over what he had gathered so far, arranging the pieces the way he might arrange figures in a ledger that refused to balance. A girl no one named at dinner, a cough behind a locked door, a clerk who had loved his old master and by the careful shape of his silences did not entirely trust the household that had succeeded him. A calendar with a date circled in pencil, faint enough to be denied, deliberate enough to mean something. None of it, taken alone, was evidence of anything. He was a guest in another family's house, and families had their private griefs and private arrangements that were no business of a visiting duke settling an old land debt. He reminded himself of this several times, and found, each time, that the reminder did very little to quiet the unease sitting low in his chest. By morning he had decided on a small, careful test of his own. He rose early, before the house had properly woken, and walked the grounds, ostensibly to inspect the boundary the old land agreement concerned, though in truth he made his way instead toward the kitchen gardens, where he had noticed, the previous afternoon, an elderly woman in housekeeper's gray directing the underservants with the brisk, weathered authority of someone who had run that household for a very long time. Her name, he learned within a few minutes' conversation, was Mrs. Birch. She had served at Ashworth Hall for nearly 40 years, since before Richard Ashworth himself was born, and she possessed, the Duke quickly discovered, the particular loose-tongued candor of an old servant who has outlasted several generations of employers and has grown weary of holding her opinions silent for people half her age. He approached the matter sideways, asking first about the gardens, then about the house, then, as though it had only just occurred to him, about the family. "You'll have known Mr. Richard Ashworth a long while then," he said. "Knew him since he was in short coats, your grace." Mrs. Birch's face softened in the particular way faces do when speaking of someone genuinely missed. "Best master this house ever had, fair with the staff, fairer with his daughter than most fathers manage to be with their sons. I understand he died rather suddenly." The softness in her face dimmed slightly, replaced by something more guarded. She glanced toward the house, as though checking the windows for anyone watching before answering. Sudden it was, strong man, hardly a day's illness in his life and then gone inside of a fortnight. Doctor called it a fever of the stomach. Mrs. Ashworth nursed him herself those last days, sent the rest of us from the room, said she didn't want him troubled. "That seems an unusual arrangement," the Duke said carefully, "for a woman to nurse her husband's brother alone, with no other family present." "Unusual is one word for it," Mrs. Birch said, and then, seeming to catch herself going further than she intended, pressed her lips together and busied herself with the basket of cut herbs at her side. "Begging your pardon, your grace, it isn't my place to speculate on matters that are long settled." "Of course," the Duke said gently, "forgive my asking." He let a pause sit between them, comfortable rather than pressing, the kind of silence that experienced listeners know how to use. Then, as though merely continuing an idle thought, "And the daughter, Miss Emma, I believe. I had hoped to make her acquaintance last evening, but I understand she keeps to her room." Mrs. Birch's hand stilled over the herbs. "3 years now," she said quietly. "3 years, and I've watched that girl go from the brightest, liveliest child this house ever held to a shadow that hardly leaves one room. They tell me it's her nerves. They tell me it's her grief." She looked up, and for the first time her eyes met the Duke's directly, sharp despite her age and entirely unconvinced. "I've buried a husband and 2 children of my own, Your Grace, and grief never once made me forget how to come down to dinner." She seemed then to realize how much she had said and straightened abruptly, smoothing her apron with brisk, businesslike hands. "I've said more than I ought. You'll forgive an old woman's wandering tongue. I've work to see to." She left him standing among the herb beds, with considerably more than he had arrived with. He spent the remainder of the morning piecing it together, not with certainty, not yet, but with the particular cold clarity of a man who has begun to suspect a pattern and cannot stop seeing it once suspected. A sudden death, nursed in private, with the household conveniently dismissed from the room. A daughter who had been, by every account, clever and beloved, transformed within months into a recluse no one was permitted to see or speak with. A date circled on a calendar that fell, he now strongly suspected, very near a 21st birthday, the age at which a young woman might come into whatever modest inheritance her father had thought to secure for her, separate from whatever passed to a male heir. It was, he told himself, still only a shape made of shadows. He had no proof of unkindness, let alone of anything worse. A man in his position could not simply accuse a grieving family of conspiracy on the word of an old housekeeper's discontent and a clerk's careful silences. But he had learned in his own life that the absence of proof was very often exactly what people relied upon when they wished a wrong to go unexamined. He returned to the house with his decision already made. He would not leave today, nor tomorrow, until he understood precisely what was being kept behind that locked door, and precisely what tomorrow's date was meant to bring. He did not yet know that tomorrow was not some distant deadline he had time to prepare for. He did not yet know that Mr. Prout's carriage was already being readied, 20 miles distant, to arrive at Ashworth Hall by 9 o'clock the following morning. He had, though he could not have said it in so many words, perhaps a single day left to act, and considerably less information than he would have liked, with which to decide how. The day passed slowly inside Ashworth Hall, though no one watching from the outside would have guessed how much was shifting beneath its calm surface. Margaret kept herself busy with the appearance of ordinary household matters, menus, linens, a note to the dressmaker about Charlotte's gown for the spring assembly, while privately counting the hours until Prout's carriage was due. She had sent word that morning confirming the arrangement. 9 o'clock, the study, the necessary witnesses already arranged among the household staff. She trusted to say nothing afterward. Everything was in order. She told herself this several times throughout the day, the way a person repeats a comforting phrase until it nearly drowns out the small, persistent voice underneath it that knows better. She had not anticipated the Duke staying a second night. She liked it even less than she let herself admit. There was something in the way he watched the staircase during meals, something in the unhurried, deliberate way he asked questions that seemed harmless until you tried to recall, afterward, exactly what you had told him. She resolved to keep him occupied. She arranged cards after dinner, encouraged Charlotte to play the pianoforte, kept conversation moving briskly enough that no silence had room to open into curiosity. It worked, or seemed to. The Duke smiled, complimented Charlotte's playing, lost graciously at cards, and gave every appearance of a guest content simply to pass a pleasant evening. He was, in fact, doing nothing of the kind. He was watching the household's rhythms, who came and went from the kitchens, which servants carried trays upstairs, and at what hours, how often Margaret's eyes drifted, almost involuntarily, toward the staircase whenever a clock struck. Upstairs, Emma spent the day exactly as she had spent hundreds before it, read what books she owned, mended a hem that did not need mending, stood at the window for longer than she could account for, watching the drive below as though something might happen there. Nothing did. A maid named Susan brought her dinner an hour later than usual, looking pale and distracted, and left again without quite meeting Emma's eyes. "Susan," Emma said before the girl could slip out, "is something the matter below stairs?" Susan hesitated at the door, glancing back over her shoulder as though to be certain they were unobserved. She was young, younger than Emma, and had only been at the hall a year, too new to the household's careful silences to have fully learned them yet. "I oughtn't say, miss." "Please," Emma said, and something in her voice, not demanding, only tired, only honestly asking, seemed to undo whatever caution Susan had been holding on to. "There's a gentleman coming tomorrow morning," Susan said quickly, quietly. "A solicitor, Mrs. Ashworth's man, not Mr. Hodges. Cook says it's about papers, important papers." She bit her lip. "And Mrs. Ashworth told the upstairs maids you weren't to be let out tomorrow under any circumstance, miss. Not even for your usual hour in the garden. I didn't think it my place to ask why." Emma sat very still. "What sort of papers, Susan?" "I don't know, miss. Truly, I don't. Only—" Susan hesitated again, and then, in a rush, as though saying it quickly might make it less of a betrayal. "Only Cook said something about your father's will, miss. I don't know what was meant by it. I thought you ought to know, that's all. I'm sorry I have to go before I'm missed." She slipped out before Emma could ask anything further, the door closing, and, a moment later, the now familiar click of the lock turning, though it was barely past 7 in the evening. Emma sat with the cold dinner tray untouched in front of her for a long while after that, turning the words over and over. Your father's will. She had never seen it. No one had ever shown it to her, or spoken of it, or suggested there was anything to discuss. She had simply understood, in the vague way a person absorbs the shape of their life without examining it too closely, that whatever her father had left behind belonged now to the running of the household, to Edmund's inheritance, to her aunt's management, and that she herself existed within that household on a kind of permanent, unspoken charity. She had never once asked why. She asked herself now, sitting in the cold with her shawl pulled tight, why a solicitor would be coming about papers concerning her father, and why, of all the days in 3 years, tomorrow had been chosen as the one day she absolutely must not be let out of this room. The pieces did not fully resolve into a picture. She did not have enough of them, but she felt, for the first time in a long while, something sharper than her usual quiet resignation, something closer to fear, and beneath the fear, very faintly, something that might once have been called anger. She thought of her father. She let herself think of him properly for the first time in months, rather than turning quickly away from the memory the way she usually did because it hurt too much to hold. She remembered him at his desk, teaching her to read a column of figures, telling her she could hear his voice almost exactly. A person who understands her own accounts can never be made a fool of, Emma. Remember that. She did not understand her own accounts. She did not understand anything about her own situation at all. And tomorrow, it seemed, something was going to happen that concerned her directly, in a room she would not be permitted to enter. She thought, with a sudden and uncharacteristic boldness that surprised even her, that she did not intend to simply sit in the dark and let it happen unwitnessed. She had no pen in her room. Margaret had seen to that years ago, after a brief period when Emma had written letters to a school friend that Margaret judged unsuitable to encourage. But she found, in the bottom of an old sewing box, a stub of pencil left over from some forgotten mending project, and a torn scrap of paper from the lining of a drawer. She did not know who would read it, if anyone. She did not know if it would ever leave the room at all, but she wrote anyway, in the cramped, careful hand of someone unused to writing freely. If anyone reads this, my name is Emma Ashworth. I am kept in this room. I do not know why, only that tomorrow a solicitor comes about my father's will and I am not to be let out. I have done nothing wrong that I know of. I would only ask that someone ask why. She folded it small and held it, uncertain what to do with it, until she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, light ones, hurried, and on impulse, without entirely deciding to, slid the paper beneath the gap at the bottom of her door. She heard it picked up. She heard the footsteps pause, then continue, faster than before. She did not know whose footsteps they had been. It was, in fact, Susan, returning with an extra blanket out of simple kindness, who found the folded paper outside the door and too frightened to read it herself, too uncertain what to do with it, and entirely unwilling to hand anything addressed to anyone to Mrs. Ashworth, did the only thing her conscience permitted. She carried it, heart-pounding, to the one person in the house she instinctively trusted not to misuse it, the quiet, watchful guest who had asked her, only that afternoon, a few careful and kindly questions about how the household was run. She left it outside the Duke's door, tucked beneath without a word, and hurried away before she could be seen. The Duke found it an hour later, when he returned from a final walk about the grounds, turning the lamp up to read by. He read it twice. Whatever doubt had remained in him, the careful, Dukely caution that had told him all week he might be imagining patterns where none existed, might be doing a grieving family an injustice by suspecting them of something far darker than ordinary grief, dissolved entirely as he read those few cramped lines a second time. He thought again of a boy of 11, told gently and repeatedly that he was unwell, best not troubled, better left out of decisions concerning his own inheritance, while a trusted steward emptied his estate around him. He had been helpless then, too young and too unbelieved to do anything but wait for an uncle to finally listen. He was not 11 any longer. He was not without power or standing, or the ability to act before 9 o'clock the following morning instead of after. He sat at the small writing desk in his room and began, immediately, to write 3 letters, one to his own solicitor in town, requesting an urgent, independent confirmation of the terms of Richard Ashworth's will, to be obtained that very night if humanly possible through the appropriate registry, one to the local magistrate, a man he had been briefly introduced to at church that very morning and whose good character Hodges had vouched for unprompted, and one, shortest of all, addressed to no one but himself, a few lines setting down plainly what he had learned and from whom, so that whatever happened tomorrow, there would be a clear account of it. It was past midnight before he finished, and later still before he allowed himself to sleep. Above him, in a cold room at the end of an unheated corridor, Emma Ashworth lay awake as well, not knowing that her few desperate lines had reached exactly the one person in the house capable of doing something about them. Only that she had, for the first time in 3 years, done something other than wait. It was a small thing, a folded scrap of paper slid beneath a door. It would turn out, by morning, to have been enough. The morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of pale January light that made the whole house look older than it was. Margaret was awake before 6, dressed and composed by 7, and downstairs in the study by 8:30, arranging papers on the desk with hands that were, if anyone had looked closely enough to notice, not quite steady. She had rehearsed the morning so many times in her mind that it had stopped feeling like a deception at all and started feeling, almost, like a formality. A piece of housekeeping, no different from arranging the linen cupboard or settling the quarterly accounts. Mr. Prout would arrive at 9. He would have with him the necessary documents, a brief statement, already drafted and requiring only signatures, confirming that Miss Emma Ashworth, due to continued ill health and infirmity of mind, was unable to attend the reading of her late father's testamentary provisions, and that in light of her established incapacity and absence, the relevant bequest would be held instead in trust for the benefit of the estate, administered by its current head. It was, Prout had assured her more than once, entirely defensible, entirely within the bounds of the law, properly witnessed, properly recorded. No one need ever call it anything other than what it appeared to be on paper, a sad, sympathetic arrangement made for the protection of a fragile young woman who could not protect herself. Margaret believed this, in the particular way a person believes something they have decided, long ago, that they must believe in order to keep living comfortably with themselves. At 8:45, Edmund joined her in the study, looking faintly uneasy in the way he always did when matters of money were openly discussed, rather than simply enjoyed. Charlotte and Louisa had been sent to the morning room with instructions to keep themselves occupied. The Duke, Margaret had been informed by a footman, had risen early and gone out walking, a small mercy, she thought. One fewer set of eyes in the house this particular morning. She did not yet know that the Duke had risen early for an entirely different reason, and had not, in fact, gone walking at all, only as far as the end of the drive, where he had stood for the better part of an hour in the cold, waiting for a rider he had sent for the previous night to return. The rider arrived at 9:12, his horse lathered from a hard ride, carrying with him a single sealed letter from the Duke's own solicitor in town. A man who had, at his client's urgent and rather extraordinary request, written out himself the previous evening to consult the county will registry, and who had confirmed, in careful legal language, precisely what the original document recorded. That upon reaching the age of 21, Miss Emma Ashworth was entitled, absolutely and without condition beyond the date itself, to the property and sum specified in her father's will, and that no provision in the document permitted that bequest to be withheld on grounds of infirmity without a formal medical examination conducted by an independent physician and confirmed before a magistrate, neither of which, the letter noted pointedly, appeared to have ever taken place. The Duke read it once, standing in the cold drive, and felt something in his chest settle into a kind of quiet, deliberate resolve he had not felt in a very long time. Mr. Prout's carriage arrived at 9 precisely. He was a thin, careful man, dressed in unremarkable black, who greeted Margaret with the practiced deference of someone long accustomed to being paid well for discretion. He was shown into the study, papers were exchanged, and the small, quiet ceremony of the morning began exactly as planned, until, perhaps 4 minutes into it, the study door opened without a knock. The Duke stood in the doorway. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and entirely immovable. "I understand a matter concerning the Ashworth estate is being settled this morning. I find I have a personal interest in seeing it settled correctly." Margaret's composure did not break, not visibly, not at first. She had spent 3 years perfecting exactly this kind of composure. "Your Grace, this is a private family matter." "It concerns a will," the Duke said, stepping into the room without waiting to be invited further, "and a young woman's inheritance. I am not family, no. But I have spent the better part of 2 days learning rather a great deal about this household, Mrs. Ashworth, and I find myself unwilling to simply walk past a closed door a second time." Prout shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Grace, I assure you, every step taken this morning is entirely within the law." "Then you will have no objection," the Duke said smoothly, "to my solicitor's confirmation of the will's actual terms, obtained last night from the county registry, which states, quite plainly, that no infirmity provision may be invoked without independent medical examination and a magistrate's confirmation. Have either of those occurred?" Silence. "I thought not," the Duke said. He withdrew the sealed letter from inside his coat and placed it, without ceremony, on the desk between them. "I have also taken the liberty of sending word to the local magistrate this morning, a Mr. Whitfield, I believe, whom Hodges speaks rather highly of. He should be arriving within the half-hour, should anyone wish to dispute the letter's contents in person." Margaret's hands, still resting on the desk, had gone entirely white at the knuckles. "This is an outrage," she said, her voice rising for the first time. You come into my home, a guest, and presume to interfere in matters that are none of your. Where, the Duke interrupted, quietly but with an edge that had not been present in his voice before, is Miss Ashworth? The room went very still. She is unwell, Margaret began, but the Duke was already shaking his head. I heard her cough behind a locked door 2 days ago, Mrs. Ashworth. I have spoken since to your housekeeper, who has known this family for 40 years and does not believe a word of the story you've told. I have spoken to your clerk, who remembers a clever, beloved girl rather better than he remembers any illness of the mind. And last night, he said, his voice dropping, I received a letter written in pencil on a torn scrap of paper and pushed beneath a locked door by a girl who did not know if anyone would ever read it, asking only that someone ask why she was being kept from a room she had every right to enter. He looked at her steadily. I am asking now, where is she? For a long moment, no one in the room moved. Edmund stared at his shoes. Prude had gone very pale and was studying the papers in front of him as though they might offer an escape route. Margaret's face, for the first time in 3 years of careful performance, showed something raw and unguarded beneath the composure. Not quite shame, not yet, but the first cold edge of a woman realizing the floor beneath her had finally, irrevocably given way. She is upstairs, Margaret said at last, very quietly. Her door is locked. Then I suggest, the Duke said, that someone unlock it. It was Mrs. Birch, summoned by a footman sent at a run, who climbed the stairs with the keys and unlocked the door herself, her hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from something that looked very much like long-held grief finally given permission to surface. Emma had heard the commotion below for some minutes, raised voices, footsteps, a carriage arriving, without understanding any of it, until the lock turned and the door swung open to reveal not Susan with a tray, but Mrs. Birch, eyes bright with tears she did not bother to hide, holding the door open as though it were the most important thing she had done in years. Come down, child, she said. Come down now, it's time. Emma did not fully understand, not yet, what was happening, but she rose, wrapped her shawl around herself out of 3 years' habit, and walked toward the open door and found, for the first time she could remember, that nothing stopped her. She came down the stairs slowly, uncertain of her own legs, and stepped into the study to find a room full of people staring at her, her aunt, pale and silent, her cousin, unable to meet her eyes, a thin man in black she did not recognize. And standing slightly apart from the others, the tall stranger she had glimpsed from her window 2 nights before, who turned as she entered and looked at her, she thought, the way no one had looked at her in 3 years, not as a problem to be managed, but as a person whose presence in the room actually mattered. Miss Ashworth, he said, with a small, formal bow that seemed, somehow, entirely sincere. I believe this concerns you a great deal. I thought you ought to be present for it. Emma looked around the room at her aunt's stricken face, at the papers on the desk, at the strange thin man beginning, nervously, to gather his things, and felt, for the first time in 3 years, the strange and disorienting sensation of being seen. What concerns me? She asked, and her voice, though quiet, did not shake. It was the Duke who answered her, gently, plainly, in a room that had spent 3 years deciding things about her without ever once asking. Your father's will, Miss Ashworth, he said, and what you are owed. What followed was not quick, and it was not simple, but it was, in the end, thorough. Mr. Whitfield, the local magistrate, arrived within the half-hour exactly as the Duke had promised, and what had begun as a quiet, private reading, arranged for the benefit of 3 people willing to deceive a 4th became, instead, a proper accounting conducted in full daylight, with witnesses who could not be dismissed from the room. Emma was given a chair, her own chair at the desk. For the first time in 3 years, a piece of furniture in that house seemed to have been arranged with her comfort in mind rather than her absence. She sat through much of it in a kind of careful, disbelieving silence, watching her aunt's careful composure dissolve by degrees as Mr. Whitfield asked, plainly, for the medical examination that had never been conducted, the magistrate's confirmation that had never been sought, the simple legal foundation that the entire arrangement had been built without. There was none of it. There had never been any intention of there being any of it. Mr. Prout, faced with a magistrate rather than a compliant family, discovered his professional courage considerably diminished, and within the hour had produced, with visibly shaking hands, the full and accurate terms of Richard Ashworth's will, the property, the £4,000, the plain, unconditional language that had been hidden from Emma for 3 years, not because the law required it, but because her aunt had simply decided she would never be permitted to read it. Margaret did not weep, and she did not, even at the end, fully apologize, though she did, when Whitfield pressed her directly, in front of her own son, admit in a flat, exhausted voice that the infirmity claim had been her own arrangement, conceived to secure the inheritance for her own children rather than see it pass, as the will required, to a niece she had never quite forgiven for surviving a brother she'd resented for marrying beneath what she considered his due in the first place. It was the first honest thing Emma had heard her aunt say in 3 years, and somehow it was almost worse than the lies had been. The consequences, once set in motion, moved with a kind of momentum no one in the room could fully control. The inheritance was restored to Emma in full, formally confirmed within the week by the same registry the Duke's solicitor had consulted. Margaret, facing the very real possibility of criminal proceedings for fraud, a possibility Whitfield made clear he was prepared to pursue, though Emma, when asked, found she had no appetite for seeing her aunt imprisoned, only for being free of her, agreed instead to a quieter resolution. A full and signed admission of the deception, sufficient to secure Emma's inheritance beyond any future challenge, in exchange for no formal charges being pressed. It was not mercy, exactly. Emma did not feel especially merciful. It was simply that she found, once the matter was settled, she wanted nothing more to do with Ashworth Hall or the people in it than the law strictly required. Society, predictably, did the rest of the punishing that the law did not. Within a month, word of the Ashworth affair had moved through the county with the particular speed reserved for scandals involving both a title and an injustice to a young woman, and Margaret, who had spent 3 years carefully curating her family's reputation, found it dismantled in considerably less time than it had taken to build. Invitations stopped arriving. The dressmaker's appointments for Charlotte's spring assembly gown were quietly cancelled by the dressmaker herself. Edmund, to his credit, seemed genuinely shaken by his mother's conduct, though shaken was, Emma reflected, a good deal easier to be than actually useful 3 years earlier, when a single word from him might have changed things considerably. Emma moved out of Ashworth Hall within a fortnight, into the modest house her father had left her, smaller than the hall, certainly, but warm in every room, with fires lit by servants she herself now employed and answered to no one but herself. It was, she found, a strange thing to learn to want things again after 3 years of learning not to. She did not trust the change easily. She woke some mornings still expecting a locked door, and had to remind herself gently that there was no lock on this one at all. The Duke called on her twice in the first month, properly, with a chaperone present, with nothing in his manner that could be called anything other than careful respect, and on both occasions did not raise the subject of courtship at all, seeming to understand, without being told, that a woman who had just learned to trust her own front door again needed rather more than 2 weeks before she could be expected to trust a man standing in its doorway. He asked instead about her father's old accounts, which she had begun, slowly, to take an interest in managing herself. He asked her opinion on a question of land drainage affecting one of his own tenant farms, and listened, actually listened, weighing her answer rather than simply admiring that she'd given one, in a way she found unexpectedly disarming. He did not call her clever as though it were a surprising compliment. He spoke to her as though her cleverness had simply always been an obvious fact, inconveniently overlooked by everyone else for 3 years. It was on his second visit, as he was leaving, that Margaret's parting words from the week of the reading returned to Emma rather unwelcome. A single sentence, thrown out almost carelessly as Margaret was being seen from the house for the last time, more out of spite than honesty, Emma had told herself at the time. Strong as an ox, your father was, the week before he sickened. You might ask yourself sometime why a man like that simply drops dead in a fortnight, and who exactly was alone with him when he did. Emma had pushed the words away in the chaos of that week, telling herself it was only Margaret, bitter and grasping for one last wound to inflict on her way out the door. But the words had not entirely left her, and on the Duke's second visit, when he asked, gently, whether anything was troubling her, she found herself repeating them aloud for the first time. The Duke was quiet for a long moment afterward. I do not know if it means anything, he said finally. It may mean nothing at all, the bitterness of a woman who has lost everything, reaching for one final cruelty. But I find, having spent some time in your aunt's company, that I am no longer willing to dismiss anything she says as simply nothing. He paused. If you wished it, Miss Ashworth, and only if you wished it, I would be glad to help you find out the truth of your father's death, whatever it turns out to be. It was not a proposal. It was not even strictly a declaration of anything beyond plain offered help. But Emma, looking at him across her own warm sitting room in her own house, with her own fire burning steadily in the grate, found it was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. Because it was the first time in 3 years that anyone had offered her the truth, whatever it cost, instead of deciding quietly on her behalf that she was better off without it. I would like that very much, Your Grace, she said. I find I am tired of not knowing things. 6 months later, the truth of Richard Ashworth's death was never fully proven. The physician who had attended him had died himself in the intervening years, and Margaret, true to form, admitted nothing further beyond what the law had already extracted from her. But an old housemaid, traced eventually through Mrs. Birch's careful memory, came forward with a quiet, troubling account of broth prepared privately in those final days, by Margaret's hand alone, that no one else in the house had been permitted to taste or question. It was not proof enough for a court. It was, Emma found, proof enough for herself, and proof enough, too, that she had been right not to feel guilty for wanting nothing further to do with the woman who had raised her. She did not dwell on it longer than she had to. She had spent 3 years of her life already given over to things done to her without her knowledge or consent. She found she preferred, now, to spend her days on things she had chosen herself. It was a clear evening in late June when the Duke of Ravensworth came to call at her house for what both of them understood by then to be rather more than a courtesy visit. Emma received him in her sitting room, in her own house, with a fire burning bright and warm in the grate, though the evening outside was mild enough not to strictly require it. She had taken, in the months since the reading, to keeping a fire lit in every room of her house at all times, whether the weather called for it or not. It was, she had told him once, only half joking, a habit she did not think she would ever quite outgrow. He understood. He had not needed her to explain it twice. He did not propose with any great speech. In the end, only asked her simply, standing by that fire, whether she would do him the honor of considering a future together, properly, publicly, as equals rather than as a man rescuing a girl from a locked room. He was careful to say it exactly that way. He did not want her to spend the rest of her life believing she owed him anything for opening a door that had never, by any right, deserved to be locked in the first place. Emma considered him for a long moment, this man who had noticed an empty chair at a dinner table when no one else thought to, who had asked a question 3 years of silence, had taught an entire household never to ask. Then she rose, crossed the small distance of her own warm, fire-lit room, and answered him not with words at first, but by doing the one thing she had not been permitted to do for 3 long years. She walked, freely, toward an open door and chose, this time, entirely on her own to walk through it. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end, If you enjoyed this Duke story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can join as a member or send a super thanks super chat. Your support truly helps us continue bringing these stories to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.